Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the museum. I'm Blaise Michtal, the National Security Director at the Bipartisan Policy Center, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you here in attendance today, those watching on C-SPAN and online, on a beautiful Monday morning after a glorious weekend here in D.C. with no traces of the swamp. And it's very easy to be hopeful on a day like today, and so we're happy to be discussing a very hopeful topic and releasing our paper on building prosperity, stability, and security through strategic health diplomacy, a study of 15 years of PEPFAR, a paper co-authored by former Senate Majority Leader and BPC co-founder Tom Daschle and former Senate Majority Leader and BPC Senior Fellow Dr. Bill Frist. For those of you who are new to BPC, our mission is to actively seek to combine the best ideas from both parties to promote health, security, and opportunity for all Americans. We drive principled and politically viable policy solutions through the power of analysis, negotiation, and advocacy. Today, we'll be talking about PEPFAR, which has been a strong example of both bipartisanship and strategic health diplomacy for the past 15 years. Indeed, this is the second time that the BPC has looked at PEPFAR. In 2015, we released our inaugural report looking at the effects of PEPFAR, both on health and U.S. national security interests. And we're returning to it this year in 2018 for two hopeful reasons. The first is that PEPFAR reminds us that the United States does not have to choose between pursuing its own interests and helping others in the world. As you'll hear more about our report's findings and their implications during our two panels today, you will learn that PEPFAR continues to be associated with improvements in socioeconomic development, public opinion of the United States, and measures of governance, stability, and civil society engagement in countries that receive those investments, all helping promote U.S. interests. Further, new in this report's findings, we have reports on PEPFAR's effect on diplomatic engagement, informed by 15 in-depth interviews with current and former U.S. ambassadors to PEPFAR countries. And we also include a new analysis that explores PEPFAR's role in the response to the 2014 Ebola outbreak in West Africa. In short, as our co-chair so eloquently put it in the report, PEPFAR tells us that America does well when it does good in the world. But secondly, and this is particularly important to the BPC, PEPFAR reminds us about the importance and the continued ability of Washington to find bipartisan agreement on important issues. PEPFAR received truly bipartisan support from its original authorization in 2003 through its reauthorizations in 2008 and 2013. And for those of you counting, we are indeed due for another reauthorization later this year, and we're hoping that PEPFAR 4.0 will be just as strongly bipartisan. So if you missed them on your way in, we have copies of the report and executive summary available at a table by the front door, as well as online at bipartisanpolicy.org. This event is being streamed by C-SPAN, and a recording will be made available later on our website. We invite you to interact with us on Twitter about today's event using the hashtag BPCLive and the handle @BPC_bipartisan. At this time, I invite you to turn your attention to the screens for a brief video from the George W. Bush Institute commemorating the 15th anniversary of PEPFAR. Thank you.
"15 years ago, the HIV/AIDS pandemic threatened to wipe out an entire generation in Africa. In the face of preventable death and suffering, my administration firmly believed we had a moral duty to act, and we did. In 2003, we launched the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, a work of mercy beyond all previous international efforts to help the people of Africa. Over the past 15 years, thanks to the generosity of the American people, millions who would have died are living full and hopeful lives of promise. We're on the verge of an AIDS-free generation, but the people of Africa still need our help. The American people deserve credit for this tremendous success and should keep going until the job is done."
thank you to the George W. Bush Institute for that excellent message and video. Good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Anand Parekh. I'm the Chief Medical Advisor at the Bipartisan Policy Center, and with Blaise, the co-director of our work on strategic health diplomacy. We have two excellent panels for you today. The first will feature Senator Daschle and Senator Frist, as Blaise mentioned, the two authors of the report being released by the Bipartisan Policy Center today. Our second panel will feature Ambassador Deborah Birx, General Charles Wold, and Ambassador Mark Starella. Both panels will be taking questions, so please raise your hand if you have a question during the Q&A period, and we'll have roving microphones and we'll get those to you. And so at this time, it's my honor to invite Senators Daschle and Frist to the stage, along with our moderator for our first panel discussion, Michael Gerson. Michael is a senior advisor to ONE, an advocacy organization that works to end extreme poverty and preventable disease, particularly in Africa. Michael is also a columnist for the Washington Post and previously served as the assistant to the president for policy and strategic planning under President George W. Bush. Thank you to all of you, and Michael, I'll let you take it away from here.
Thank you, that's appreciated. It's an honor to be with you all. PEPFAR was my best experience in government, and one reason the program is exceptional is because of its bipartisan nature. It spanned the gap between social conservative and traditionally liberal global health advocates. It spanned the gap between parties, and it spanned the gap between administrations, with President Obama deeply committed to this effort. So PEPFAR has been a haven, a safe harbor from the bitterness of our politics. And these two men represent how government can work in a great national cause. They turned the idea of PEPFAR into reality, and they remain its tireless advocates. So good to be with you.
Thank you.
It's often said that PEPFAR, as the largest investment a country has ever made in combating a single disease, is one of the most successful global efforts in terms of its scale and impact. The program celebrates its 15th year this May, which means that some people in the audience may not know about the pre-PEPFAR period. Can you remind us what things were like for people living with HIV in the early 2000s in some of the hardest hit areas?
Tom, you want to jump?
Sure. Well, first of all, Michael, let me just compliment you for all of your work and leadership. You were one of the inspirations. You were one of the true organizers. And I think for the record and for those who may not know the history, Michael had a lot to do with the fact that it was successful as it was. And secondly, the man on my left was just incredible. It was a real pleasure to work with him on that extraordinary effort. And but going to your question, Michael, I would say that people started to die of HIV/AIDS in the 60s. But by the year 2000, right around the time that the Bush administration took office, over 25 million people had lost their lives. There were countries in Africa where 20% of those living in these countries had been infected, and so it was becoming more and more widespread. There was an enormous social stigma attached to the disease, and so people were reluctant to even become engaged medically or organizationally. And there was a lot of confusion about what was right, what was wrong, what was the truth about the issue. And that led, of course, to an enormous degree of confusion just generally about how we approach the issue. The final thing I think I would say initially would be how expensive the cost of the medicine was. $125 a month with marginally effective treatment initially. That compares now to around $6 with a dramatically improved quality of care. So things have changed a lot, but it was really dire in that period right after the turn of the century.
Senator Frist, I remember visiting South Africa in shantytowns where you would see grandparents and grandchildren with an entire generation nearly gone. Talk about what you saw in that period.
Michael, it is exactly right. That image that you just laid, this layering out, is one that, to me, I think best dramatizes what was happening. It was a hollowing out of society where when you traveled around in the 90s, where I spent a lot of time, I spent 2 to 3 weeks in Africa somewhere, some continent, doing medical work during that period of time, through the 1990s and through 2000. And in the 90s, in the mid-90s, literally you would see grandmothers and you'd see little babies, and you would see no sort of middle age, nobody above sort of adolescent years, of women, of girls, of men, because of this hollowing out. Now, eventually we knew the virus would come down and create over 11 million, coming back to the time of the early 2000s, 11 million orphans, HIV orphans. But initially it was that hollowing out. The virus, I first began thinking about 1981 when there were only 5 cases in the United States. I was a resident at Mass General in Boston at that time. Nobody had ever talked about the virus at all because we didn't know it existed. And although 1981 seems like a long time ago, to me, it doesn't seem like it was a very long time ago today. And then that year, a few thousand people died. We still didn't know what the virus was. And then the next year, 2,000 people died. And then within about 3 or 4 years, 3 million people died in the world. Remember, from a handful to 3 million. And over that period of time, Africa was especially hit. It started there in the 1960s. And by the time of the 1990s, when I started to go there, this virus, which had been defined by our NIH about 1983, cagey little virus. Every time you get a treatment for it, it changes conformation, and therefore it escapes treatment. And to this day, we don't have that treatment. But what it was doing was hauling out society. It was hitting the military. It was hitting the civil servants. It was hitting the politicians, the people who would keep civil society safe. It was that hollowing out that in the 1990s, and really up into the 2000s too, PEPFAR was the reality that we all had to face.
Yeah, I remember seeing a lot of child-headed households. It affected families. Mark Diebold talks about seeing child-headed villages where there were no village elders left. Really extraordinary. But then the drugs start arriving. You had, at the time, what was called the Lazarus effect. Can you describe that period, how the hope advanced in the aftermath of PEPFAR?
Yeah, I'll jump in just because it was so real. So I would spend 2 to 3 weeks, even as majority leader and when I was in the United States Senate, taking off my political hat, but going and doing medical mission work. Went to about 14 different countries during the period of the 90s and through the 2000s. And early on, it was really called VCT, Voluntary Counseling and Testing. Why? Because as we talk about, generally the costs were so high, not just of the drugs, but of the tests themselves. There were just no tests for it. And then the antiretroviral, which was sort of the miracle drug, as Tom said, was costing about $8,000 a treatment. So to Americans and people across the world, with 3 million people dying every year, 20 million people infected at $10,000, people said it was impossible. But then, and again, it'll go into the PEPFAR story, we had some political movement, we had our industry, we had our pharmaceutical companies all come forward. Why? Because all of a sudden the cost started coming down, the antiretroviral started coming, and in a place like Botswana, where life expectancy had been around 60, and then through the 80s and 90s, it had come down to 38 years of age in Botswana. Then all of a sudden, through American leadership, when PEPFAR coming in, it came back up, and eventually, and we'll get there in terms of the story, it's back to about 62 years of age, and that's a Lazarus effect.
That's pretty extraordinary. What did you see as far as in the aftermath of PEPFAR?
Well, I think the most exciting thing you see is that people are getting their lives back. On a personal level, people were actually becoming more optimistic about their life, about their future, about their communities. You saw economic growth and prosperity restored, as Bill was noting. I think one of the greatest impediments to employment and economic growth is illness. And when you see the widespread impact that HIV/AIDS had across the spectrum, you saw a resulting decimation of the economy, and then from that, a decimation of the stability of governance itself. I mean, there was a great deal of uncertainty about how stable these governments were going to remain, given the tremendous volatility and turmoil that existed as a result of all of this uncertainty, and I would also add deep psychological pain. I mean, there was a stigma, as I said earlier, that really was so pervasive, and that also affected society in a very profound way. But as soon as PEPFAR came along, as soon as we actually could see some real results, hope and optimism, confidence began to be restored. And that had just a catalytic effect on the economy, on stability and governance, and the capacity once again to restore some degree of normalcy in many of the countries in Africa especially.
And Michael, I think that hopelessness, and which I'm sure we'll hear about in the next panel and this panel, but again, this sense of time and place, especially post 9/11, but even the 1990s, bin Laden, again, I'll be corrected by the next panel, I think left Sudan in that area in the mid-1990s, but part of the hopelessness when you're a 12-year-old or a 13-year-old and you just see no hope, not just because you're poor or you're living in a little ducal or you don't have a home or there's bad sanitation, but you have no hope because you have death and destruction and chaos, and your father has died and your mother has died, and then all of a sudden somebody comes in and gives you that little element of hope, of life. That is probably one of the best antidote of the time. Remember, now after when 9/11 hit and terrorism was rampant, at the time, if you were given hope of a future, of being able to have a family, take care of your family, put a roof over their head, send your daughter to school where you didn't have it 3 years before, that is a powerful, powerful antidote to whether it's terrorism or what I call peace, using health and medicine as a currency for peace.
Just by the way, it was also interesting how treatment encouraged testing, where you would talk to people who said, I know it's not a death sentence now, so I'm going to go be tested because there's hope. And it really expanded that element, which was necessary. Treatment really was important to testing. I want to get to a point that Senator Daschle made that's a focus of the report, which is the effect on socioeconomic gains in these countries. A lot of this has not gotten as much attention in terms of GDP per capita growth and worker productivity, in terms of the ability of people living with AIDS to become employed. How does supporting developing countries with access to HIV treatment result in improved development?
Well, I think I would say there are at least three major components to it. First of all, as I said earlier, the fact that you have such pervasive and widespread illness affects the capacity for employment itself. So unemployment necessarily is going to go up dramatically. The reverse is true. Once you find ways with which to address that illness and make people healthy, unemployment goes down, people are beginning to develop a capacity for work again, and that has profound economic consequences. So it starts with that realization that there is a direct connection between being healthy and having a healthy and strong economy. But then it goes beyond that. You've also got to create greater capacity, and that capacity can be built through improvements in infrastructure, and PEPFAR did that. PEPFAR helped enhance the infrastructure within any country to address not only the challenges of the illness, but really the whole concept of making a healthier society more productive again. And that was a very big part of what I think what people began to see. There have been studies done showing the correlation between presence of PEPFAR and economic growth and vitality. Clear connection between the strength of the program and the strength of the economy. South Africa in particular, but there are many other countries. So we've seen an enormous appreciation of what this can do, and it has macroeconomic effects that we're still today appreciating now 15 years after the fact.
And Senator Frist, Africa is a major trading partner of the United States as well. The report points out that there's about $40 billion in trade in 2016. 4 of the top 5 partners in the region are countries that have been major PEPFAR partners. Can you explain the links between PEPFAR investments in public health and the growth of these and other trading partners?
Yeah, I think trade is a good sort of surrogate or corollary or additional point of what Tom was talking about. In this report, unlike our report 5 years ago, we go much more into this sort of economic development. When Tom and I were leading in the Senate in the evolution of this bill, which passed very quickly in a strongly bipartisan way, which I smile just because of where we are today, but in a strong bipartisan way coming in.
It was months, right?
It was
Between the
months.
announcement
It was
and
January
4
State of the Union
months.
message. The president, who we just heard from, unbeknownst to 99.9% of the people, even his own Secretary of Health at the time, made that statement, and then within 6 months, the whole bill was passed, wrapped up, and worked with the House of Representatives. But even then, in our first report, we didn't concentrate on this sort of socioeconomic GDP growth, trade growth, which this report actually does a lot more. The sort of impact of HIV/AIDS is as much as 4% fall in GDP because of this one little KG virus and its impact. So obviously, if you can reverse that and add to it hope and optimism and employment, as Tom mentioned, it can be explosive. The other thing our report does, which you mentioned, is looks at the impact on trade. So not just health and productivity in a community or in a region, but in a country, and then impact on other countries. And you mentioned the 4 out of 5 of our biggest traders what happened to be our most important PEPFAR partners coming forward, where we invested the most over time. So we look at that correlation, but it's pretty obvious because once you have, as Tom said, better employment in a community, you give hope to a community, you have young people who are less interested in fighting and causing trouble because all of a sudden they look to a hopeful future. You have tin roofs over a house and girls going back to school because they don't have this threat of predators themselves. You have a country that has shared with the United States in its leadership. This wasn't the U.S. flying in and putting Americans on the ground and doing it. These were partnerings. These were taking local people, sharing information with them, using their ideas, and building an infrastructure, not just in the capital city, but throughout that whole country, wherever you go, the smallest little community. The smallest one I'd travel to and do surgery in, there'd be 3 or 4 little kids, and I'd say, "What's your name?" And they'd say, "America." I'd say, "America?" And they'd say, "Yes, my parents named me America because of this thing that they've done for," they didn't say HIV/AIDS, but that kind of impact. And then the last thing is the governance itself. Because it's a partnering and it is resources going in, one of the things that the U.S. and our global partners and our military, everybody involved, insisted upon is a degree of transparency, is a degree of participation, is a degree of the sort of ideals that are exactly the sort that you want that government to have if they're going to be a trading partner. You don't want to be trading with somebody who you can't work with, who you can't trust, who's not transparent. And so using health as this tool, this instrument, all of a sudden this transparency came through government, and this legitimacy of government working with our government meant more and more trade over time.
PEPFAR has been described as an expression of American values in the tradition of the Marshall Plan, the Peace Corps. This report talks about how PEPFAR is associated with more positive public opinion of U.S. leadership in countries where it is invested heavily. What do you think are the attributes of this program that contribute to these favorable views of the United States?
I think if I could start, Michael, by saying, I think, first of all, just the impression that people have about the U.S. as a compassionate and a generous country, but also a country that has a capacity to work with people. You know, I think one of the values, while I give great credit to our diplomats in all countries, they deserve our thanks and our praise and our gratitude for all that they do. This goes beyond what a single embassy can do because it's so widely dispersed. It's in the communities themselves. And it really carries to the very core, the grassroots of these communities, the real values that America represents at its best. You know, in these communities, in the churches, and in the local community centers, in the clinics, that representation, that physical understanding of the generosity and compassion of the American people is very evident. And I think that makes a big difference. I mean, there's a great story of a young kid who said he saluted every day when he went by the clinic because there was an American flag, and he would thank the United States for its commitment to him and his health. And I think the other thing that would really contribute as well is the fact that so much local talent is being used. It isn't Americans coming in with nothing but people from Washington or New York. These are local people, helping their families, helping their communities, but being given the resources and given the know-how, the technological capacity to help. So that local talent is a big factor as well.
Senator Frist, why is it important that the world views America favorably for our diplomats, for our security in other areas?
It's a great question, and again, we didn't go into it. I'm going back to those days in 2003 at that State of the Union message and our discussions on the floor. It's not why we went into it. It really was a public health, global health, hollowing of society. And that was the really thrust of it. It really was a moral imperative. It doesn't matter where you're born, whether it's in the United States or Ethiopia or Sudan or South Africa, that if you were struck down by a disease, you should be lifted up. And you should never live in fear. It never, in the 21st century, live in fear of a virus striking you down because of a lack of attention. But the impact ultimately has been just that. We've had the socioeconomic impacts, the impact on trade itself. Our ambassadors, and one of the great things we did in the report that we take credit for, but that we heard that our team did, was to talk to the ambassadors themselves. And again, we'll talk about it in the next panel. But then you hear this great breadth of this broad power that Tom talked about. That's not just the embassy or the diplomat, but it's spread throughout a community in every little tiny village, in every little tiny group of 3 or 4 little houses, that people feel the caring and the compassion. It happened to be America who led on it, but it was really a global effort. We did PEPFAR, and we did the Global Fund, which U.S. led on that as well. But then there were 30 or 40 other countries who participated in that Global Fund, and they worked in sync. So it was the caring and the compassion of humanity that people felt. This using medicine or health for diplomacy, strategic diplomacy, is a real thing. And I mentioned in my sort of lifetime of spending a lot of time in Africa, I've always said medicine is a currency for peace. And our military might is ultimate. I mean, the military might for the world is just absolutely protective of our freedoms, protective of our democracy. But what I think we increasingly realize, because of the success of this government-led but broad, bipartisan, people-supported, both in America and outside of America, is that caring and compassion and health can be a true currency for peace and understanding. Because you got your military might protecting all the freedoms and all, but on the ground, you have some sort of aid coming in that saves the life of your child for $1.50. And it comes from some people you don't know. That breeds faith in humanity. And yes, the source of most of it, or half of it, comes from America. But that using medicine. You don't go to war with somebody who's just saved the life of your child. You don't do it. It's what all fits together, using caring and compassion as strength, just like we use military as strength.
Given that this was so effective, what are some of the other public health threats that might benefit from a U.S. investment that strengthens strategic health diplomacy?
Well, Bill can probably talk about it much more than I, but I would say that we've already seen the impact that this extraordinary effort has made with our ability to cope with Ebola a couple of years ago. That was, I think we applied a lot of the lessons learned from PEPFAR to what we were challenged by with Ebola. We've also been able to see where Hep B and Hep C efforts, especially in Africa, have been able to be more successfully addressed as a result of this effort. Even non-communicable diseases like diabetes and heart disease. And then, and here I defer to Bill especially, but even with cervical cancer problems that we're now witnessing because of the early efforts to detect and then treat HIV and AIDS. We're able to detect more capably those who might be also afflicted with cervical cancer. So there's just an enormous array of other illnesses that we can address because we've been able to set up the infrastructure, because we've been able to take the lessons learned over the last 15 years and apply them to other instances as well.
You know, sometimes people argue that we need to spend more money on health systems instead of vertical programs.
Yeah.
But PEPFAR made a lot of difference with health systems, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it increased professionalism and standards and a lot of other
it's
things.
unbelievable story. And that's why these 15-year retrospectives with new information and new examination analyses are so important to Tom and me and the BPC. We came in because we had this little cagey virus. I said it's like you're constantly changing, so you can't hook a molecule onto it and kill it. It still can't be cured today. Kind of interesting. We still got to cure it. And the goal has got to be to contain it. And that's sort of what we're doing and why this continued funding is necessary. We started with the virus, PEPFAR, President's Emergency Fund for AIDS. That's one little virus, $60 billion spent, more than anybody in history. The Global Fund, the sort of side fund at the exact same time, and President Bush, and you played a big role of it, in that we were the largest we were the first gift, the largest gift to the Global Fund. That expanded it to HIV, AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis. Other infectious diseases, at the time HIV was killing 3 million a year, tuberculosis 2 million, malaria 1 million a year. Now for HIV, AIDS, we cut AIDS-related deaths down to 50% of what it is. But what happened, Michael, and you just hit it right. When you come in and you're going to have an antiretroviral or niverapine, which costs $1 to save a baby, you have to set up a system. You have to set up a system of delivery, of compliance. You don't take it one time and go away, of compliance, of ongoing, of surveillance, of people coming back in. The whole testing of it was revolutionized in tests which would cost $300 down to about $2. You had to set up an infrastructure, 11 million orphans. A mom who has HIV/AIDS would give birth to a baby with HIV. You put $1 niverapine in there, it doesn't happen, but somebody has to identify the mom, set up the infrastructure, go into the community, and while you're there, you have other issues of maternal and child health. And it might be breastfeeding, it might be early detection of other diseases, it might come into a clinic. So all of a sudden, this huge infrastructure gets built on this single little virus, expanded to other infectious diseases, and then an infrastructure broadly set, which ultimately saves countless other lives. If we say maybe 20 million lives have been saved so far by this investment, and that's conservative, probably 5 to 6 times that have been saved because of this broad infrastructure that has to be set for the diagnosis, delivery, and treatment of that initial therapy.
It's amazing to go to hospitals in Rwanda that used to be overwhelmed with AIDS cases and now can do diabetes and heart disease because
and
it's
cancer.
under control. And
even cancer.
No, exactly. We've seen from the 2019 House and Senate appropriations bill that there is still strong bipartisan support for PEPFAR and other critical health efforts. Let me read you a quote from your former colleague, U.S. Senator Lindsey Graham, who is chair of the Senate State and Foreign Operations Appropriations Subcommittee. He said of the 2019 bill, "This bill makes America safer by supporting critical diplomatic efforts around the world, providing security assistance for our allies, directing stabilization assistance for areas in chaos due to conflict, and supporting life-saving health and humanitarian assistance to people in dire need. Now is not the time for retreat. This bill signals to the world that America is not backing away from its role as leader of the free world." In an era of America first, why does that leadership remain important?
I would say it remains even more important perhaps now than ever, in part because the world is in such chaos. You've got 25 failed countries. You've got an enormous challenge on virtually every continent. And I think American leadership, especially in this context, has never been more critical. Secretary Mattis said it succinctly once. He said, "You cut back on funding for programs like this, I'm going to have to buy more ammunition." And I think that's a succinct way of saying that there is a direct correlation between the stability we can create through good health and good economic growth and support at the local level, and what ultimately we have to look at from our national security perspective, regardless of the continent. So small investment, big results. And we've seen that now for 15 years. This arguably could be the single most important investment we can make to overall stability worldwide, especially in parts of the world that we don't have a very strong military or diplomatic presence today.
Mike, I'd add, and you opened with it, that this has been bipartisan from day one. From day one. It didn't start. Actually, in our early years, it didn't. It was very kind of partisan. And this was, and Tom mentioned it, was hugely stigmatized. It was an entity, a condition that was pushed off to the side. I remember Jesse Helms writing an article, I think it's for the New York Times, you probably remember it, basically saying this is something we just don't need to be dealing about initially. And then about 4 months later, after the American people spoke, after Republicans and Democrats spoke, after the faith-based community came on board and said, 3 million people dying of a single virus every year, 11 million orphans out there, we've got to act. Bono from U2, who was at a concert the other night and talked to him afterwards, and again, he played a huge role in saying America is great, America is leading. He can be critical of America too, and this is the single greatest thing this country has ever done. That kind of image from the outside, not ever done, but ever done in the healthcare field. But to put it in perspective, we're talking about, if this is the budget, we're talking about everything we've just talked about being this much. All global health is about 1/4% of our nation's budget, 1/4%. We've talked about GDP, reputation, national security, America First, which in our document, if you read it, you'll see the 4 principles of America First that are outlined, and maybe the next panel will get into it, of President Trump. We meet every one of those principles, different language, but we meet every one of those principles coming forward. 1/4, but the issue does boil down to this, which we point out in the report. If it's only 1/4% that goes to all global health, not just HIV/AIDS, but all global health, and if it really is a currency for peace, and if it really is a national security issue, and an issue of individual well-being where people can provide for their children and give them hope for the first time in 20 and 30 years, if it is all that, why is it that our administration right now comes back and says, let's cut that global fund by 30%? Why is it that the administration right now says, let's cut it by 12%? Now, luckily, the Congress has come back and essentially given it flat level funding for the last 4 years, which is good in this environment overall. It's about flat, so we've come back every time. But now is not the time to step back. Now is not the time to have an administration cut global health when we have this 15-year history of positive, constructive, broad, yes, global benefit of being able to cut the deaths related to HIV/AIDS in half in less than, by that, 15 years.
We have time for a few questions. We only ask that you ask your questions in the form of a question. So. I think a microphone's
There's a
coming
microphone
here.
coming.
Hi. First of all, thank you for being here. My name is Olivia Landau. I'm with the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. I'm wondering how PEPFAR and the Bush administration dealt with South African former President Mbeki's opposition to ARVs and HIV denialism.
Yes, so the question is, at the time, we had countries and recipient countries with high HIV/AIDS who basically from a, I can't say from what standpoint, but the narrative was that antiretrovirals don't work, that HIV/AIDS is not caused by a single virus. Didn't really say what it was. It was called wasting disease at the time. And when I first started going to Africa in the 90s, nobody knew what it was. Everybody was dying. They called it wasting disease because you were wasted. So what we did at the time is, and this is a pretty interesting part of the story, and Michael Gerson's the expert up here, by the way, now. He wrote a lot with the president to articulate this. But what the president did before was sent Tony Fauci, our head scientist in the United States of America for infectious disease, but before even the announcement, sent Tony Fauci to Africa and basically said, what is the science? And I forgot him. He was down there for a couple of weeks. And he came back, again, this is before the State of the Union, and basically said, Mr. President, this can be done. The naysayers out there, including the leaders in Africa, are wrong. It is caused by a virus. If we mobilize American industry, if we make it a public-private partnership, if we put, at that time it was about $15 billion over 5 years into it, I can promise you based on science, let me say I promise, I can pledge to you based on science that we can diminish the cost and reduce the burden on this disease and cut it in half. It came back to science, so plowed straight ahead. But remember, you had recipient countries that said, America, the West, stay out of our business. It's not caused by a virus, and the antiretrovirals don't work. What we did is relied on science and the best of our industry and creativity and drove it straight through it.
I do remember.
Go ahead.
Please,
Michael. No, I was just going to say, just to complete that thought, I would say it's the results. And Becky became convinced once he saw the results, and the results were happening all around him. And it took a while, but I think that really had, to Bill's point, once you had the science and then you had the results, it was hard to deny how you could do the same in your own country.
What do you remember those times? You were right about it.
Well, I would only add, though, that I remember sitting at a lunch next to a South African health official who told me that AIDS could be cured with garlic.
Yeah.
Okay. And you had this element, but beneath that, there were a lot of really good health people in South Africa that knew what was going on. Okay. You had some leadership problems, but you had a real health bureaucracy that didn't hold these views.
And you had countries like Uganda.
Right.
And again, those of you who are familiar, Uganda came forward where the First Lady of Uganda went on the equivalent of television at the exact same time and said our country, and that was before we had really good treatment, but through VCT, voluntary counseling and testing, HIV plummeted there. People began to live. So you had countering countries with that voice. And Uganda was probably on the forefront at that time, where the President and the First Lady were out front.
Let's get another question here. Want to go over this side, maybe? Here.
My name is Embry Howell. I work at the Urban Institute. And I was curious about the connection between condoms or prevention method and the political issues around family planning and condoms from perhaps religious groups and others, and how you dealt with that.
Yeah, and I'll jump in there. First of all, I don't know whether to answer historically or sort of present, but what it was at the time is this. We knew people were dying, so we had to give, Michael again was the one, not just dying, but suffering around the world, and had to give voice to the reality of what that was. The answer, remember, at the time, we didn't know very much about antiretrovirals. We knew they cost $100,000, and this whole idea of applying it. What we and our scientists and our industry told us that if we came together, we could get the price down. So the therapy end of it, everybody can rally behind. But therapy with 5 people, walking in with HIV every day, there's no way to be able to get enough therapy to all of them with the number of people who are dying. People were just coming on board. So the only real answer was the prevention end of it, even to this day. Right now, we've cut it way down, but it's prevention. Prevention, we know abstinence works, right? So that's kind of obvious. Number 2 would be we know that birth control condoms protection work. So what we did, because you had Democrats and you had Republicans, you had evangelical, you had faith-based, why did the faith-based community come on board even though some of them were very much against condoms, an element of birth control? And basically from a government policy standpoint, we didn't get that involved with that. We basically certain parts had to be watered down just a little bit to get the coalition that was there. And we basically brought in a faith-based community and said, you go about it the way you want. If you want the A, B, C's, you push that forward, but support that legislation. If you want, that's some kind of, I won't go to the ABC, but you can either say you're for condoms, against condoms as part of it. But we left it broad enough. At that point in time, a lot of people didn't realize we were distributing, at that point in time, more condoms than any country in the world already at that point in time. And that's how it was handled. And then people came on board. If people didn't believe in antiretroviral therapies are going to cost too much, they could still come on board. If people didn't believe in using condoms, Just the ABs, just the sort of faith and the abstinence part of it, just the belief and the abstinence part of it, still come on board. And that's how that coalition was developed.
Okay, let's do one more question, maybe in the back. Can we?
My name's Sabrina, and I'm with Malaria No More. And I was just wondering what you thought of the future in U.S. investments in relation to global health security and the reemergence of, for example, polio in Venezuela and the upturn in malaria cases in the Americas.
Huge. I'll jump in just real quick, and Tom and Mike, you ought to comment. The reason this funding has to be, this isn't a thing that's cured and goes away. We have two issues, and you brought up one that we should have mentioned really earlier, and that is, which is one of the big ones, the reason why we have to continue to invest or this will come back. We do not have a cure. We do not have a cure for HIV/AIDS. Malaria, a little bit different. Malaria is mainly kills children. And again, just so people will know, but it was very much part of the global fund and Malaria No More coming. The thing that you brought up is the resistance to current therapies today, whether it's malaria or tuberculosis or HIV. You had this emergence of resistance. So you'd be given an antiretroviral or you'd be given an antimalarial drug, and all of a sudden this malaria evolves and it no longer works. So we have to have the continued research coming in. The other big issue that we talk about in the report is this resurgence of young people in Africa today. Yeah. And as that resurgence of young people, they need to both receive that education, because culturally, if you're not receiving that education in some way, again, those same sort of behaviors with that virus, for which there is no cure yet, would come right back.
I would just add that I think we've mentioned a couple times now the importance of the infrastructure that we've created. And that infrastructure is so vital as we go forward and take the lessons learned. There's a new concept that is oftentimes referred to as data diplomacy, using data for purposes of applying what we now know, the infrastructure that we now have, to address the challenges that we now face. And I don't think anyone can fully appreciate the magnitude of that contribution because it's hard to document in a macroeconomic fashion. But it's there, it's real. And data diplomacy and transparency and the kind of qualities and values and tools that we brought to this challenge are very applicable as we look to the next 15 years. We have to apply them just as effectively as we've done in the past.
We have to conclude there, but I want to thank Senator Daschle and Senator Frist for 15 years of leadership in the cause of compassion and American leadership. So please join me in thanking them.
Allow me to echo Mr. Gerson in thanking Senators Daschle and Frist for their leadership and their contributions to this report, and thank Mr. Gerson for helping guide us through not just a history of PEPFAR, not just a description of its infrastructure and how it works, but really a very touching and impactful story of the change that it has wrought on the continent and how it has changed the lives of millions. To talk a little more about what PEPFAR does today and the impact it can continue to have, I'd like to call up our second panel. Please come to the stage. Ambassador Deborah Birx, U.S. Global AIDS Coordinator and U.S. Special Representative for Global Health Diplomacy. General Charles Wald, former Deputy Commander of United States European Command and the co-chair of the BPC's National Security Program. And Ambassador Mark Storella, former U.S. Ambassador to Zambia and current Deputy Assistant Secretary of State at the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration. Our moderator today is Dr. Charles Holmes, who in addition to consulting on this report, is the faculty co-director of the Center for Global Health and Quality and a visiting associate professor in the Department of Medicine at Georgetown University. Prior to joining Georgetown, Charles served for 4 years as the CEO of the Center for Infectious Disease Research in Zambia, and prior to that, he served as the Chief Medical Officer and Deputy U.S. Global AIDS Coordinator for PEPFAR, and was their founding director of the Office of Research and Science. Charles.
Thank you, Blaise, and it's a real pleasure to be here this morning. And given the range of diplomatic, public health as well as security concerns and issues that we've talked about already, we really couldn't ask for a better panel here today. I won't go into bios, but I'll just introduce, of course, Ambassador Birx, General Wald, and Ambassador Starella. And I've had the great honor of working with both Ambassador Starella and Ambassador Birx in various settings over the years, so this is really a special occasion. I'd like to start with you, General Wald. As referenced earlier, prior to PEPFAR, societies, as we've heard about, particularly those hardest hit in sub-Saharan Africa, were being truly ravaged by the HIV epidemic, with sharp declines, as we've heard, in life expectancy, rapid rises in orphanhood, and faltering economies. The new report finds that PEPFAR has been successful, and other health aid investments have been successful in impacting health, socioeconomic development, and also reducing state fragility. And because of these effects, we've heard about parallels between the PEPFAR program and the Marshall Plan. Given your background with the European Central Command, can you remind us of some of the objectives in the Marshall Plan and the advantages that had in rebuilding Europe as well as for the United States? And do you see parallels with the PEPFAR program?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I was asked to prepare for this question, so I've looked it up a little bit. But for those that don't remember the Marshall Plan, I think it was at the time somewhere around $13 billion for all of Europe after post-World War II, which today sounds like not a lot of money. But at the time was quite a bit. and I've read where there's some revisionist history now that is saying that the Marshall Plan was implemented by the U.S. government to give us a better global market and increase the market of the United States, which is kind of cynical, meaning there was not a benevolence there. It was mainly for self-improvement of our economy. And I suppose there is some of that. But I think there was also the reality that Europe, I mean, if you think back on it, and I kind of think of it in today's context, why would we, President Trump is getting ready to go to the NATO summit this week. I just talked to Jim Jones this morning. He's going over there too, and there's probably not a more supportive person in the world than Jim Jones on NATO. But you have to say to yourself, why are we involved in Europe, and later we'll talk a little more about Africa, but what is in our interest there other than maybe historical relationships from generational relationships, whatever the case may be? It's in our interest to have a group of nations around the world that are stable, that we can depend on to help solve some of our security problems. I mean, we're going to hear from two really significant people here as far as our diplomacy and our government goes, which is really the primary. But there's a military aspect, and was a little bit alluded to by Senator Frist and Senator Daschle earlier. But my feeling as a military person has always been the best thing you can do as a military person is avoid conflict, avoid involvement. So prevention is number one. If you could, I think that most military people would say, idealistically, if you could do away with the military, it'd be a good thing. I'd rather not be in combat. So the Marshall Plan had a couple things going. Number one is there was a certain amount of, I think, benevolence and just sincere concern for our European friends. I mean, I don't think any of us can imagine World War II and the devastation. And so there was a certain amount of just kindness involved. Two, there was a serious, George Marshall's probably the smartest thinking military person we've ever had in our nation. And he was smart enough to know that, that the tools of security and national security are multifaceted. Like Mike Mullen said one time, our former chairman of the JCS, the number one national security issue for the United States of America is our economy, which is ironic for a military guy to say that. If we don't have an economy, we can forget about national security. So Marshall saw that. And then I think the third part was he saw the future, that it's kind of repetitious, and that security in Europe is not necessarily guaranteed, and we're going to need a partnership there of people that could actually purchase their own military capability, train with us, and be there as a partner. So if you look at HIV/AIDS, which we're going to talk about now, I felt the same way when I was in European Command. At that time, European Command, for those that don't know or probably don't care, we had Africa in European Command, most of it, and our responsibilities were about 92 countries, 50 some were in Africa. We spent a lot of time there, and it was kind of a nascent area. It's a little more thought of today because of some of the what we consider extremism or potential terrorists that are being grown there. But at the time, it was an area that was not very well known. There was not a lot of involvement beyond the ambassadors, which was great for us that they were there because they did great work. But there wasn't any real strategy involved in Africa. The strategy that evolved was basically driven by the fact that China was investing quite a bit in Africa and was kind of replacing us as what we wanted to be influential. But the HIV portion of it became a huge issue for us from the standpoint of kind of rebuilding capacity in Africa. And the more capacity our friends, wherever they are, have to take care of their own problems, the better it is for us. So that's basically the Marshall Plan comparison.
Thank you. As you know, and as we talked about in the first panel, Africa is experiencing rapid growth in its younger populations, such that by 2030, it's estimated that about 50% of people living in sub-Saharan Africa will be under the age of 20. And in a study that was referenced in the new report, the CIA in the past has called a youth bulge a destabilizing force. General Wall, I'll just stick with you and then we'll move on to Ambassador Birx. Why is a growing youth population, while being a positive on one hand, a concern from a security perspective? And what are some of the ways you see PEPFAR and other health and development programs as being essential to contributing to a brighter future for that influential population?
Yeah, I mean, I said it to Mike Gerson earlier, which I've never had a chance to talk about this before. But one of the sad parts about President George W. Bush's administration is he should have taken big credit for this. Now, he's not the kind of person that would. But when we first started in European Command in 2003, again, it was fairly nascent. Not a lot of people were very versant in that. Hadn't been there to Africa. There was a growing instability in the continent already, as was alluded to by Senator Frist. You know, Osama bin Laden had been in Sudan. There was a lot of activity in North Africa. We had a group of Europeans that were kidnapped in North Africa, about 40 of them. That became a big issue, and this group that kidnapped them became Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb. We had issues in Mali, in Timbuktu, as a matter of fact. We had issues, Libya obviously going bad. And much of it had to do with the reality of social media with the Arab Spring, but also the youth bulge. But probably most of it was because there was communication amongst young people that started for them to there was a realization of what kind of a government they had, what kind of society they were growing up in. And there was a disenfranchisement of young people becoming pretty apparent. We had a fantastic intelligence officer in EUCOM, a guy named Rick Zahner, who became head of Army intelligence, that coined the word I think he did, but this disenfranchisement of the youth in Africa. And his concern was, unless something's done, this youth bulge, I think is referred to in the report, is going to be looking for things to do. First of all, they don't feel supported by the government, number one. And number two is they really have no relief for what their life is all about. They're looking for some kind of involvement somehow and some kind of relationship. And the whole issue about paying attention to the young folks in Africa was, again, it's the right thing to do, but primarily it was a security issue for us. Well, number two is, the youthful transmission of HIV/AIDS process was really growing issue, and the mobility of the society there was growing. So it became real apparent to us in UCOM, I think, that the HIV/AIDS program was going to be a big deal for us. And again, I took Senator Hagel, who became a SecDef later, to Africa several times, Senator Inhofe, others, that realized the amount of money that was being put into this program was going to pay big dividends. And we'll talk about it a little bit later, but the impact of the fact that our interest in European Command was for having Africans take care of their own security and stability. It was not in our best interest to have to do that. We'd like to help them. But the HIV/AIDS program may have turned around much of what's happening in Africa today that probably would have been 10 times worse if we hadn't had the PEPFAR program. There's no doubt about it.
Ambassador Birx, as U.S. Global AIDS Coordinator, you've made the collection and more effective use of data really one of the hallmarks of PEPFAR. And one of the major issues that's come out of those data is, as General Wald referenced, we have the youth bulge, but also the adolescent girls and young women who are now accounting for 74% of the new infections in sub-Saharan Africa in that age group. Given the rapid growth of this population in Africa, it's been suggested that these high rates of infection in that age group could actually lead to a reversal of some of PEPFAR's hard-fought wins and gains over the years. Why are these rates so high in adolescent girls in the region? And what is PEPFAR doing to protect them from HIV infection? Also recognizing that HIV prevention is not just a health issue, but really has multiple societal determinants.
Well, that's a lot of questions. So, but thank you. I think we were very excited about data and the use of data because it lets us see down to the communities and the individuals. And I think when you heard that discussion about where PEPFAR was grounded in transparency and knowledge and translation of science to action, we had to be able to see everything, not just an average. I always call it the tyranny of averages. You can't look at a country on an average and say that's how you're serving everyone. And when we started looking geographically and started doing these surveys that were down to the community sites, that's when we found everybody that we were missing. And you can understand how this happened, because when PEPFAR started, it really was an emergency to save lives and to save parents. And so a lot of our treatment went to the very sick. And we had forgotten, I think it's sometimes, that you have a disease for 8 to 10 years before you're sick at all, but it's silently destroying your immune system. And so when you think about it that way, you have to realize that you had a lot of 15 and 20-year-olds that were probably infected then, but weren't visible to the healthcare delivery system. And what these surveys has allowed us to do is to see everyone. And so it's not that we have these things we call incidence rates, and then we call absolute number of new infections. So the incident rate, as was described in the prior panel, is actually dropping in all of the different age groups. But when you have twice as many 15 to 24-year-olds than you did at the beginning of the epidemic, you see that you have to, again, half those incidence rates just to tread water. And so we really noticed then that young women, and this really was a study done by Slim and Koresha Karim, who really showed us 5 years ago the risk to young women. And so we saw a lot of infections, but we didn't understand their risk. And there was a lot of a sense that it was cross-generational institutions and sexual activity cross-gender. We really found that it was men 6 to 7 years older with women and adolescents that were 16 with a 22-year-old. And people always say to me, that's so shocking. And I'm like, well, weren't you in high school? I mean, didn't you want to date the college kid who had the car and some disposable income? I mean, this is universal everywhere. So we started really listening to young women to understand what was putting them at risk. And that's why we launched DREAMS, and that stands for Determined, Resilient, Empowered, AIDS-Free, Mentored, and Safe Young Women, recognizing that young women are in a community with multiple faceted risk. and we couldn't just approach it in one direction. And so we had to bring together, just like PEPFAR has always led in bringing people together, bipartisan and then interagency, we had to bring the Ministry of Education with the Ministries of Finance, with the Ministries of Health, and the Ministry of Gender to work together in a new way, to really look at every aspect of a young girl's life and address the issues that they're faced with. And I think one of the biggest issues we've uncovered through our violence against children surveys is about a third of young girls' first sexual experience is rape. And so these are difficult questions, and that's where you use the diplomacy of data. Because when you have that objective evidence, then you can take that to these ministries and work together to address an issue that crosses young women's lives. And that's, I think you've seen our recent report. We saw between a 25 to 40% decline in new infections in young women, the absolute number of new infections, because remember, that's what's going to drive costs, absolute number of new infections in many of these communities. But like all data, it also points out where you're failing. And I think part of this bipartisan support and the bipartisan report that just came out is for us to understand where are we doing great and where do we need to do better. And I think with the young women, we can clearly see that we probably don't have programs that are optimized for young women in highly urban areas. So if you look at Johannesburg, if you look at Nairobi, if you look at Lusaka, we had a 10 to 15% decline in absolute new infections, when in many of the other areas we had a 60% decline. So what data is useful for is to point out where you're doing well, but to also point out where you're not doing well and fix it. And I think that's how we want to use data. We want to use data to both understand where we're doing well, but also where we need to fix things. And people often, data drives change. So people say to me all the time, when will PEPFAR stop changing all the time? Never, until the epidemic is controlled. Because the virus, as Senator Frisk said, is tricky. And it constantly evolves and changes and affects people in different walks of life. And so you constantly have to be looking and changing to keep up with it.
So in the same way that you've worked with to make data more available and to use data, you've also opened up the country operational planning process, which is the annual planning process for PEPFAR, and made it more transparent. But you've also involved the partner governments as well as civil society. And as we heard on the previous panel, that kind of transparency is really one of the hallmarks of strategic health diplomacy. What prompted your move for that greater transparency and the involvement of both governments and civil society? And what are some of the benefits and challenges that you've experienced from that?
Well, you heard from the previous panel where PEPFAR was grounded. So we went through and looked at, and I want to thank many of the people in the audience who wrote really comprehensive reports on how PEPFAR could be better, and still do that. And we read them all the time and work in those areas. But one of the reports, and several reports said, you know, you talk about transparency, but you're not transparent. You write these things in secret in rooms, and then you tell everybody this is what you're going to do, and the data's not available, and we don't know what's going on. So we felt like we had to be more transparent. Now, that made everybody nervous, from the agencies down to the implementing partner, that all this data was going to be up and available, and it is. So if you go to pepfar.gov, every data of every site, 55 or 50,000 sites that PEPFAR works in, has that data on the website so that everybody can see it. The communities that we're serving can see it, the governments can see it, civil society can see it. And part of what we do in the planning process is to bring together communities that are affected and impacted by HIV with the government who's providing services, and often with PEPFAR funding, and bringing that together so we're both listening. So we're listening to each other. And I think that's the big difference. Through listening to each other, we have been able to double the number of people on treatment in a flat budget in the last 4 years, just by listening of how we could do things better. And we've quadrupled the number of prevention impacts by increasing the circumcision number, flat budget. How do you do that? You do that by listening to the communities telling you, you're doing it this way, you'd be very much more effective if you did it that way. And these communities and governments are doing this when there's really no funding often going directly to them. People are altruistically telling us and helping us be better without paying them to help us do better. And I think that's really been the spirit of PEPFAR, and still buoys our spirits all the time when we're constantly doing change management, is to listen to people talk about and help us. And I know many of you, I see many of you in the audience who came and helped us on the DREAMS program for young women. You weren't receiving PEPFAR funding, but you wanted that program to have impact because you cared about young women around the world. And that's what we still see in this program every day, is people coming forward to help us and really bringing their intellect and their spirit and their wisdom to us every day to make us better. And that is so powerful. So keep writing your reports and keep helping us get better, because we are in this until we get control of this epidemic. You heard there wasn't a cure. There is a cure for malaria and TB. So we are working against something difficult, and there's not a vaccine. So those are being developed and worked on right now by NIH and scientific institutions around the world, and so they need to continue to be funded to do that. But in the meantime, there should be no excuse to not move forward as fast and as effectively as we can.
Can I pile on for a second? Going back to kind of the point about data, kind of the irony here is that probably 100% of you in here already know the issue. You're already supportive of more PEPFAR, you understand the problems with HIV/AIDS and the security part and all that. But the narrative has to be better. I mean, first of all, people like yourself or people in this audience understand totally, I think, what you're saying. I had dinner with, or lunch with a European parliamentarian when we were back in Africa Command, or US EUCOM. And we talked about the benefit of stability operations, or putting money into what some people would refer to as soft power, and the benefits security-wise. And he said at lunch, he said, you know, I agree with you 100%. It's like my constituency doesn't get it. They don't understand why we're, in this case, Europe and the United States, why Senator Thune would tell me, my people in Rapid City don't understand why we're spending money on Africa when they got a pothole on 16th Street or something. And the problem is you've got to start developing the narrative. So I asked our GAO at the time, the General Accounting Office, what do you kind of estimate the amount of money that we save by actually investing in prevention and soft power? And they came back with a number that for every dollar you spend on prevention, which I would consider HIV/AIDS, PEPFAR money as a prevention of instability issue, for every dollar you spend on prevention, you save $10 in response. In other words, for every dollar you spend on prevention, you save $10 in military spending. Now, we should have more of those stories, because that's exactly what's happening to us. Now, even if you're the most heartless person in the world and don't care about humankind or other people, by the way, if you travel over there, you get a feel for why you should actually help, because the suffering is unbelievable. But just from if you're a purist that could care less about anything but the United States, those are the kind of numbers we need to have out there, and we need to have that narrative just developed. Again, very sophisticated. I love what the ambassador said, but the average American in Minot, North Dakota could care less unless they understand there's some benefit for them.
Ambassador Starella, building on the idea of developing more country ownership through the data diplomacy and the kind of transparency that Ambassador Birx talked about, you and other ambassadors, including Ambassador Kolker, have referenced ways that PEPFAR has helped you open doors in the cases of difficult relationships with governments, and built a kind of trust that enabled you to pursue your foreign policy and security objectives. Could you give us an example or two of where you've used that?
Mm-hmm. Charles, amazingly, in Zambia, PEPFAR was a game changer in the United States being able to achieve its broader strategic objectives, not just our health objectives. Initially, we had a lot of trouble gaining access to the government. They didn't want to meet with us. We had the opportunity to announce our PEPFAR framework. It's a lot of money. PEPFAR, just because of its size, has real weight. And we were announcing $125 million. That really opened up doors for us with the government. And then we went to the government and said, we have more money that we can bring to the table. It was really end-of-year money. that we could bring to the table for ARVs, but we want you to match it. And it took 3 meetings with the president. And finally, the president said, okay, we will. He didn't actually know we were going to spend the money anyway. But anyway, it gave us the leverage, and that really helped. But there were really other areas that mattered. A big thing that we cared about strategically was democratic elections. And the elections there had a somewhat stormy and difficult history, sometimes good, sometimes not so good. And it turned out that the most important allies for the United States in pressing for clean elections, an independent electoral commission, actually counting the ballots, were the 3 mother churches, the Episcopalians, the Evangelicals, and the Catholics. We had great lines to them because they were our partners in PEPFAR, which meant we knew all of the leadership, and they trusted us. And so instead of us having to say the Electoral Commission needs to be independent, we had these churches each Sunday in the pulpit saying, we want an independent Electoral Commission, and we want the ballots to be counted. The election, as you know, took place. The opposition actually won, and the president, who was incumbent, conceded. And there was a peaceful transition in Africa on a democratic basis. We had been working to have a defense relationship with Zambia, and we'd had lots of trouble because of the history of the United States and Southern Africa. A previous president had said, the president of Zambia had said, AFRICOM will never lay a boot on the ground of Zambia. That meant China was active. That meant Zambia was not a capable partner for peacekeeping. It meant that we did not have any inroads. However, the Minister of Defense at the time and his Chief of Defense Staff noticed that our clinics that we were supporting through PEPFAR funding on bases were saving the lives of their soldiers. And not just their soldiers, but their soldiers' families too. And it took a little while, but over 2 years, that really broke things open for us. And I remember taking the Minister of Defense of Zambia to Stuttgart to meet with our commander for U.S. Africa Command. And shortly after that, Zambia offered to host Africa Endeavor, our biggest military exercise inside Africa. That happened in just 3 years. You wouldn't think it, but PEPFAR was at the heart of making that change. So I saw the real strategic results that PEPFAR could produce for American diplomacy in very diverse areas.
It's remarkable. You've spoken before about the role that PEPFAR has also played in your public diplomacy efforts as ambassador. And could you help us to better understand some of the ways in which you were able to link up PEPFAR with public diplomacy? And then related to that, one thinks about the improved public perception of the United States that we've heard about earlier. And do you think that some of these public diplomacy efforts have really helped to drive that influence of PEPFAR?
Public diplomacy requires having a good product to sell, but it also requires being able to reach the audience you're trying to sell it to. And the United States has a good story to tell around the world in so many areas. Certainly PEPFAR is a great piece of that. After being in Zambia for a while, one of the things I saw was that political leaders were important, but tribal leaders were really important. And we didn't have that much access to tribal leaders. One of the challenges that Debbie Birx has already referred to is voluntary medical male circumcision. We saw through the different analyses that this was a way of really improving our ability to combat the HIV virus. How could we convince Zambians who are not used to medical male circumcision this was a good idea? Well, the answer was to reach out to the tribal chiefs. And the tribal chiefs actually also were eager to have the opportunity to partner with us. We would go to their districts and bring all of the media with us, and it would highlight their leadership, and it would start changing ideas about practices that actually could help. That wasn't all, though. One thing that really helped us was we needed to reach young people. Young people is where the infections were. Young people obviously are the future. As General Wald was discussing, there's this bulge coming throughout Africa. So one of the things we did was when we traveled, we brought with us pop icons. So these are young TV personalities, musicians, artists, and they would go with us and they would perhaps put on a little performance. They would certainly attract huge numbers of young people to whatever the event was. But even more than that, they were on their machines texting and tweeting. And I know that U.S. ambassadors are absolutely fascinating to teenagers in places like Zambia, but they found the artists and the musicians much more interesting. So we reached a much, much wider audience. That was something that we could do through PEPFAR. And it meant people, young people, knew the United States was doing good things for Zambia. And they were hearing it not just from us, they were hearing it from popular culture icons.
Thanks. Well, we could go much longer with this wonderful panel, but I do want to open it up to the audience for any questions you may have. Okay, let me go up here.
Dana Weckesser, Global Health Partnerships Consulting. Thank you very much. This was very enlightening. I assume this goes to Ambassador Burks. No one mentioned partnering with the corporate sector or private sector. I'm wondering if that is being done to help further everything. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. We've been very intentional about our public-private partnerships, and we have tried to utilize their wisdom and intellect in new ways. So with dreams, with circumcision, with issues where we're not having the impact that we need to have, we put out a call to say, can you help us? And our most recent one, our largest one, was Dreams. We also did it for circumcision with the Bush Institute. But with Dreams, Johnson & Johnson, Gilead, Vive, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, all came together, the Nike Foundation, now Girl Effects, and said, this is what we can offer to you. And that was extraordinary because Johnson & Johnson knew how to do market segmentation to reach, again, public health people. We talk in a special language that is very boring to young people. Johnson & Johnson knew how we had to speak to 15-year-olds versus 19-year-olds versus 24-year-olds and really helped us bring what they do for marketing to our public health program. In exchange, Johnson & Johnson, through the PEPFAR brand, which is well recognized in Africa as the generosity of the American people, had immediate access to another market for their American brand. So it was a bi-directional real movement, and I think it's really the core reason why Dreams is successful. We're putting out a call right now to public-private partners to work with us on our biggest challenge right now is finding well men. Men who aren't sick. And if we want to combat HIV, TB, if we want to deal with the TB pandemic and the dual infection, we can't wait till men present with very low CD4 cell counts. And like many regions of the world, well men do not want to come to the clinic at all. So really getting into what kind of words can we utilize, what kind of information does it take to get a 25-year-old to come to the clinic to be tested and then go on treatment if they need it, or get the prevention information that they need to remain negative. So the public-private partnerships that we have now are very large and they're having a huge impact. And I think it's having an impact on the private sector as far as access to new markets. So this is really a very bi-directional movement that we've had over the last couple of years.
Question in the back.
Hello, Logan Sheets from Strategic Healthcare. My question for the panel is, in a recent development since the last reauthorization of PEPFAR funding, how important do you think funding for PrEP or pre-exposure prophylaxis will be in preventing new infections globally?
So that's a great question. And again, our job is to constantly apply the new science. So the new science that has come out is how effective PrEP can be, particularly among high-risk young people, among key populations. Just like we brought Treat and Test All, this is the next venue. We're working very closely with ministries of health and ministries of youth to really work this message into the work that we do, because again, just like young men, young people don't want to come to the clinic. They don't see themselves as ill, and remember, for the first 8 years, you feel great. And if you're not infected, you feel great and don't think that you need prevention. And so these are issues that we're working on right now with governments and communities to really understand how to bring that message forward. It clearly has a huge impact, but so does delay of sexual debut, so does preventing rape. So all of these pieces have to come together, and so we're pushing on all of those elements. And if you know us, you know that we're unrelenting in pushing in all of the different elements to ensure that we can have the maximum impact and prevent as many new infections as we can, because the new infections are moving into this group that's going to be 50% of the population. And I think we're also working with governments and with the defense forces to really understand how important keeping girls and boys in high school are, because that's where we can get messages through to young people. So we're really working in a continuously horizontal way, which I think as General Wald says, we don't talk about that enough. We don't talk about the billions we've invested into the health system. We don't talk about the billions we've invested in institutions for young people's health and welfare. And I think we have to do a better job of converting that message into the strategic message that is important to Americans in Iowa.
Yeah, let me just pile on. Excuse me. There's a group in the United States called the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition. Maybe some of you heard of it. But there are 185 3- and 4-star retired general officers that are involved in that. That's 35,000 retired military, 500 of the Fortune 500 companies as well as NGOs. And it's advocacy for foreign aid, because foreign aid is always a last priority for a lot of people because of votes at home. No offense, senators, but the fact of the matter, most Americans think and you're probably at the high end of the educational level of Americans would vote that we give about 25% of our budget, I should say, is for foreign aid. It's actually 1%, and a quarter of it's what Senator Frist talked about. So we need to educate Congress as well. There was a STEM staffer in here. I hope you have the message. You probably do. But I used to take Senator Inhofe to Africa quite a bit too, and he'd pray with the presidents of those countries, and from a religious standpoint, and he's pretty supportive of the foreign aid program. He's one of the last people most people would guess would do that. Lindsey Graham is one of those people that are way on top of this thing. Senator McCain, they understand it. Goes back to what the ambassador said. We have to have a narrative that fits for people that necessarily don't think of foreign policy or foreign affairs. Or I remember the saying in Africa for us was, the Chinese give the Africans what they want, and the United States tells them what to do. I mean, we're losing the battle there, and this is a long-term issue that we need to look at as a national security issue. There's a whole humanitarian side too. There's nothing wrong with feeling good about what you do, but we've got to get the story out.
Could I just follow on with what General Wald just said? Earlier on, we talked about the Marshall Plan, and the Marshall Plan saved the continent of Europe. If you read, and I recommend you to, President Bush's autobiography, he refers to PEPFAR as his aspiration for a medical Marshall Plan. I was very struck by what Senator Frist and Senator Daschle said about their experiences early on in this epidemic in Africa, where parts of the continent were hollowing out. What I would say is that when they hollow out, it doesn't go silent, it goes chaotic. That means there are opportunities for other infectious diseases that can spread to the United States. It means there are opportunities for radicalization, and it means there are opportunities for people to flee, which means migrants showing up on borders all over the world. The United States, I believe, through PEPFAR, has helped save a continent. That has been a strategic investment on behalf of the United States, not just for the good that we've done, which is absolutely fundamental, but for the real strategic interest of the American people going forward. So I hope that that strategic view will be really well understood and appreciated, especially by Congress as it thinks about appropriations.
Thanks for that. And I'd just say, with these myriad benefits that have been identified in all of these different realms, it's very clear that required robust support must continue. And in fact, with some of the emerging challenges that we've heard about, particularly with preventing HIV in the youth, that increases will be needed in the coming years, I would imagine. With that, I would like to thank very much our distinguished panel, Ambassador Birx, General Wald, and Ambassador Starella. Thank you.
Charles, Ambassador in General, it was a terrific discussion. Thank you. So I hope everyone has a chance to, on your way out, pick up a copy of the BPC report released today on PEPFAR and strategic health diplomacy. And we welcome your feedback and comments over the months and weeks ahead. If you don't get a chance to read the report in its entirety, I'll put in a little plug to take a look at page 15, figure 6. They say a picture speaks 1,000 words, and if you look at page 15, figure 6, you'll see how all of this is interconnected. When you have a program with significant health benefits that has attributes of strategic health diplomacy, there can potentially be secondary effects that can enhance our national security interests. So please take a look at that. I'd like to conclude today's program with a few important thank yous. First off, thank you to Senators Daschle and Frist for their just tremendous leadership of this project. Thank you. I'd also like to thank the senators' staffs as well as BPC staff, in particular Hannah Martin and Jessica Mitchek, as well as our consultants, Dr. Charles Holmes and Dr. Matthew Kavanaugh. Matthew is a political scientist and director of the Global Health Policy and Governance Initiative at the Georgetown Law O'Neill Institute. I want to thank all of our panelists and moderators as well today. You know, it's really your validation of the strategic health diplomacy concept that's central to ensure support for global health initiatives and for the role of soft power in American foreign policy. So thank you for that. And finally, I want to thank all of our partners and our funders, in particular Gilead Sciences for their support, and also the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Thank you. And thank you, everyone, for spending the morning with us. We look forward to keeping in touch. Thank you for being here. Thank you.